manipulate it into a direction. And it's not actual trust. I think actual trust is based upon the recognition of something real and true within the participation of the other.
Yeah, and I want to address this, Mills. I was wondering when trust was going to come in. So I think discussing hidden agendas is worth talking about. So it's interesting, Mills, because we kind of did, right? We said people can say they find agreement, right? But then proceed as if nothing has changed. So again, if somebody says, well, this thing happened, right? Like if somebody says, well, clearly, you know, the United States doesn't interfere in elections in other countries, and somebody else says, yes, but don't you think it's suspicious that they're the ones that sold the voting machines and the people who set up and configured the voting machines were CIA operatives? Might indicate that you're wrong. And they said, well, I agree that that happens, and they continue with their thesis. There's their hidden agenda. Now, is their hidden agenda conscious? Probably not. And that's important to note. Like, not all people are rational and evil, right? A lot of evil manifests as the result of them not being conscious of what's going on around them, and that's the problem. And okay, so there's the follow-on from Mills. Is my time, energy, and attention, T, going to wind up supporting harming people, scapegoating, etc., that sort of concern? Well, look, first of all, I'm not with Jonathan Peugeot in that scapegoats are bad or anything. I actually think they're inevitable, but different discussion. So yeah, I mean, look, your time, energy, and attention goes to whatever you put it towards. And so if you try to put it towards, we'll say, something about a virtue, right, where your cause and your reasoning is virtuous, then the fact that the other person isn't being virtuous is not a concern anymore, because you're putting your time, energy, attention where it belongs. Is that going to work? Is it going to have the end effect that you want? Maybe not. And again, we can point back at that conversation on Randas United, where it was clear that there were disagreements in terms of what was manifesting and how, right? And there were disagreements about how to see what had happened. But there was no communion around the things that actually happened. Like, it's a video. You can watch it. You can see that people weren't treated unfairly, that people were greeted, and that they were asked to share. And you can see that it wasn't like me doing all the things that happened, right? And that some of the things that I did, other people also did, which might, and I don't like the sort of agreement through intersubjective means, right? But it is an indicator, and that's part of the problem, is that there's an indication that if a bunch of people are being inviting and being welcoming in different ways, and that's not working, that maybe that the problem is not that, right? The problem is something else, and it's not even necessarily implementation of that. And so again, I think this comes out, and what you need to worry about is your time, energy, attention, what you put it towards, right? Because I've spent lots of time, energy, attention of mine putting it towards manifesting a bunch of things, and that a lot of them haven't worked out. Some of that's clearly rebellious audience that I'm speaking to at some points, but some of it's other things too, and that's sort of worth understanding, is that there's disagreement going on when it's stated as agreement, and that's a big problem. Dan Smith, culturally, people of similar paths commune together and are closed off mostly to opposing paths. Yeah, sometimes. I am not sure of the best way to eliminate diverse cultural systems and paths. Well, look, diversity is inevitable, and some of it's good. And that's where everyone's upset. They can't tell good diversity from bad diversity, or the right amount of diversity from the wrong amount of diversity. And then you get Paris on fire.
Well, hold on. I want to go into that because there's an implicit.
I wanted to continue
Okay,
his.
okay.
It does continue, right? For example, both Russia and Ukraine have the goal of having their country strong. I disagree. Big enough. I disagree. And protected. I thoroughly disagree. Yet they're engaged in a war with each other. This is a prime example of a misframing. Okay, Ukraine was shooting rockets into Ukraine since 2014. That happened. That was still happening. That was always happening. Now you can argue, oh well, that was just Russia, but that doesn't make any sense since it was happening. And it also doesn't make any sense that since 2014, if that was happening, why didn't Ukraine do anything about it? Because they really kind of didn't, right? They could have joined NATO. They could have asked for help. They could have done a bunch of things. They didn't do it. So there was a disunity there. Ukraine's not a country. Ukraine's never been a country. Ukraine is never going to be a country, and Ukraine is never going to have been a country. It was always this split region. It's true genetically. There's 3 different cultures there. It's true physically. It's just maybe 4. Okay, 3 genetically. There might be 4 cultures ultimately, right? And there may be a 5th forming, right? But it's not formed. Right, and so there's all sorts of reasons why that's not actually true, why that's actually bad framing. So I did want to address that, but go ahead, Manuel. You can go back to the previous comment or however you want to.
Yeah. So, like, opposing paths, right? I think most of people, cultural communion, are on their path, and then there's not their path, right? So, like, I think that's fundamentally the distinction that they're making, right? Like, us and not us. And the opposition frame is almost never there. Like, when is there an opposition frame, right? Well, the opposition frame comes in when there's the sense of oppression, right? So if you say that there's this group, or probably better said, class at this point, right? Like, there's this class of people because they're not unified, but they're distinguished by a characteristic, right? So they're classified. They're not unified. There's a class of people that have this way of self-expression, and this way of self-expression is inhibiting our group's self-expression, right? And that's where you start going into the opposition path. And I think when we're talking about Russia, Ukraine, I don't think Russia and Ukraine were in opposition. Like, I don't think that was a real thing. The opposition came when the integration with the West was happening. So there is the choosing of a path, the choosing of an identity is threatening another identity, and then that has to be resolved in a way, right? Like, and that can either be resolved by acquiescing, by feigning agreement, because there's not an actual agreement there, or there can be a show of force or threat of force, right? And like, when you threaten force, now you're in a different place, right? Because, like, if people are not going to follow your threat, either you're going to be a hypocrite or you're going to have to act it out. And so, like, that's a really dangerous place. And when you're playing games in that dangerous place, then bad things will happen.
Well, and I do want to address this, Dan. I get your point about your bad example, but again, what if all your examples are bad? And so, with that, I will show you bad examples. So, both of this, brothers are always fighting brothers. Well, not always. They did during the Civil War in the United States, for example. We can kind of go into some of that if you want. Russia and Ukraine are not brothers. It's 4 different cultures. And the reason why parts of Russia or parts of Ukraine were firing rockets into parts of Ukraine is because they are not brothers. And it's bizarre because there's 2 or 3 different languages being spoken at the same time, which is a good indication that there's, not. And the strange thing with Ukraine for me is that I, unbeknownst to me, knew a bunch of Ukrainians, but none of them ever told me they were Ukrainian. They all told me they were Russian until the war broke out, which is a really weird thing to do because people from other countries with that problem, there was a guy, Teddy on BOM, used to regularly tell everybody, well, I'm in Israel now. but that's not where I'm from. So he would double identify. And there's nothing wrong with, well, I'm a Ukrainian identifying as Russian or whatever, but they didn't do that. They just didn't talk about Ukraine as though it was some kind of stain on their existence until the war, and then there's a reason, right? And so Catholic with Protestants are not brothers, okay? And there's a deep asymmetry between Catholics and Protestants, namely the Protestants literally, actually, and not all of them, but most of them, from what I can tell, literally have their children in school write essays about the evil of the Catholics, okay? The Catholics never do this with the Protestants, ever, right? They just don't have that attitude. They're not brothers. They're not the same. You can't equate them because they are that significantly different. Sunnis and other Islamic clubs. I mean, look, doctrinal differences are differences, and that's because they can't get to an agreement in participation. And so they can say, we agree on all these things, right? But the agreement and participation is important. That's why I've said to Paul Vanderklee many, many times, the problem with Christians is that they can't agree on the things they agree on. They can't say, no. Here are the things we absolutely have in common. We're going to set aside all the disagreements and participate on the things we have in common. That would change the world overnight. But they all refuse to do it, despite the fact that I've told them multiple times on many, many streams and videos on many, many channels that that's what needs to happen. Like, and that they could do that tomorrow if they weren't so busy arguing. And that, like, feigning agreement, right? They're feigning agreement. They're faking the agreement. They're saying, oh, we agree on all these things, but also, by this doctrine is terrible. And you know, oh, look at the Orthodox. Even they don't like your Catholic doctrine. And you know, and it's interesting that Catholics don't actually engage in any of that. Incidentally, might be worth, nor do the Orthodox, to be fair, might be worth noting. And then I want to deal with Dan Smith's example here. Maybe a better example would be two grocery stores across from each other, their goals being shared. They don't have shared goals, dude. I don't know what to tell you. So they don't even have shared operating procedures. Like, businesses do not all have the same goal. Like, there's a whole class of businesses called nonprofits that they cannot legally have profit as a motive, and they don't actually have profits. And so they don't share anything and charities don't share anything in common with profit and non-profit businesses, even though they're all businesses. They're all types of businesses. And so I think we very much get caught up in making a false equivalency and then saying, aha, here's an equivalency. And really, there are significant differences. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, different people are in business for different reasons. Like, the guy who runs Table Rock Tea up here in South Carolina, in Pickens, which is right on the North Carolina border, way up in the mountains, basically, or at the foothills of the mountains. Their reason for being in business is very, very different from, we'll say, every other business in the area, right? Because they're very committed to getting proceeds donated to their charity, which is a charity that they founded, that helps people drill water wells in Africa and other places, I believe. And like, he patented and gave away the patent for a drilling technique that's easily transportable in carry-on luggage or checked-in luggage or something, and is repairable in the field. Because, you know, if you give somebody a nice modern drill, that's wonderful until it breaks down or needs parts. And then when you're in the middle of the freaking jungle in Africa, it doesn't work so well anymore, right? Or South America or Asia, wherever, right? And so those are very different goals from, say, the goals of something like Merck. And Merck is a wonderful company in some aspect, because they made the river blindness drug, I think it is, free. They just free. We're going to produce this for free. We're not going to charge anybody for it, right? We're just now the problem was, they were like, it's here in California. And of course, all the people with river blindness are in Africa, roughly speaking. So somebody had to build a charity to put together a distribution network and do all the other things, right, to make that happen. But in some ways, Table Rock Tea and Merck are very similar, even in their, because Table Rock, as far as I know, is not a not-for-profit business either, right? They're trying to make some money, although the amount of money they make is minuscule compared to Merck, certainly. But their goals are very, very different. And that's the problem, is that you have these deep differences that you're not recognizing, because you can always find something in common. You can always find something to say agrees, and then you don't see the differences anymore.
Yeah, and I think what we're talking about is, well, like how much agreement do we have, right? Because the agreement that we have allows or borders of the cooperation that we can have. And so we have two options. We can look at, can we cooperate, or we can look at our disagreement. But if our disagreements between the Protestants and the Catholics, for example, are mainly of a nature that doesn't have a pragmatic implementation, because like if there's even disagreements, right? Like disagreements on that nature should not be relevant to manifesting something on earth that is shared, and having a cooperation in that. And when you have an identity that's literally uh, embedded in protest, right, which would be identification against, right, or identification in turning away, then that is problematic. And it's like the same thing goes for the two stores, right? It's like, well, like is this store looking for profit, or is it the store looking to provide for the community, right? And it's like,
Right.
well, as long as their highest goal is to provide for the community, then they can commune around providing for the community, and they don't have to be in disagreement, right? Like
Right.
they can
Right.
choose specializations, they can coordinate specialization or
Well, and
whatever.
there's also similar goals. So one of the things that sort of took me off guard. So I live in a Sioux Horse town. It's very cute. I love my town. It's fantastic. And in the Two Horse town, there's a grocery store. There's a couple of grocery stores. I think there's like two. Like so there's like two grocery stores around here somewhere, and they're moderate sized grocery stores, not huge. Down the street in the city, there are big grocery stores. In the cities, the outskirts of the city are not that far away because it's a huge city. Columbia is an enormous area. But I often go to the one that's closer to my house that's in my little town here. And one day I go there and there's all of this set up and there's a line and there's people set up giving away bags of food. Okay. This is like 200 feet from the big grocery store. 200 feet. There's no conflict there. They're both in the business of providing food for people. Now, you could argue, well, people are going to drive up to the grocery store, and most of them will because there are driveways the other way. But this is the driveway from the main drag through town, Route 1, the main drag, right? Like the big road. And right there, you turn in and boom. And part of the reason why it's there is town hall, such as it is, or maybe not town hall, but the police station and such are right there. It's a little tiny building. It's Two Horse Town. It's quite quaint. It's very adorable. So there's this big giveaway of food in front of a grocery store, right? Now, what do you think the odds are that the grocery store is actually coming out and bringing some of its profitable food and giving it to that cause? 100%. I guarantee it's 100%. Because store managers have a lot of power and people like to do good things for other people because it makes them feel good, even if they're not good people, by the way, which is something to watch out for. And so there's no inherent conflict there, right? Even though you could go, well, one's for profit and these other guys are just giving stuff away. And look, I'm sure the grocery store not only donated a lot of food that day and therefore didn't manifest its full profit potential, which is not the same as having a loss. Those are two different things, right? But also had an actual loss from people going, oh yeah, I'm poor, give me free food, and then not going to the grocery store and actually paying for food. I'm sure that happened, right? But so what? Like they found a way to agree and participate in their agreement, and it was beautiful. And I think that's the right attitude to have towards it.
Right, and so what are we talking about? We're talking about a bunch of framing. Like, okay, like if we go back to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it's like, well, Russia is trying to achieve one thing, NATO is trying to achieve another thing, Ukraine is trying to achieve a third thing, and they didn't manage to put them in relationship in a way that they could communicate and commune, and then that blew up. And so,
Right.
like, it's important to make this concession. I posted a tweet today that was about the ability to recognize that there needs to be a coherence within whatever group of people that you want to manifest something in, and that coherence needs to come from something that is shared. And if we don't maintain the coherence, how are we going to manifest anything in the world anymore? Like, it's not possible. And these people, they're so jaded, like they're so full of envy that they're not willing to grant the opposition or the other interest group, because that's a better way to frame it, because like you don't have to put it in, like there's another interest that needs something, and they're not willing to give it to the interest. And it's like, well, like if you're not willing to give it to the interest, now you're losing common ground, and you're imposing the zero sum situation at that point. And then it's like, okay, like if you want to impose a zero sum situation, now we're in the realm of violence, because like I'm gonna have to protect what is mine.
Yeah, and that is actually somewhat a good example. I mean, I think the problem with Ukraine was it was being used by a football by both sides. And the one side got tired of losing the football game and said, look, there's a problem here and it needs to be resolved, and you're not resolving it. And even though we sort of took Crimea as a message, the message didn't get through, and it was ignored for 8 years. Right. It's like, well, if you're going to ignore a message like that for 8 years, you kind of get what you deserve to some extent, right? You kind of get yourself in trouble in some significant fashion. And that's a problem, because now you're in trouble in some significant fashion. And that's not good for anybody, really. And that's where the problem comes in, is that, yeah, there's an issue here. And that issue is that you're laundering money through this thing, and you're using it for your own political gain, United States, and for political manipulation of your own country, which isn't good for us, by the way, as the United States. And so I'm kind of like, oh, Russia's doing what's right for the United States to some extent. Oh, we may disagree about that, but there's a way to see it that way, that's absolutely true. And at the same time, there's a problem in that how do you resolve that? What do you do about that? Because the Russian-speaking sections of Ukraine have all the resources, maybe except half of the farming or something. And so, what does that mean? Like, and I'm not saying I'm smart enough to understand any of this stuff, right? But you can see where the problems are, and you can see where the lack of agreement is, because war is a good example of something that doesn't end with more war. And like, war doesn't end war. What ends war is negotiation. And negotiation is finding agreement. Or a better way to put it, maybe finding a way to commune together in spite of a conflict that can't be resolved except through force. And so it's always wise to try to do something about that.
Yeah.
Well, you want to go?
Well, I just wanted to say on that front, that's why conflict is sometimes necessary, but this is an old adage with history and war. I mean, you get so many quotes of even to the point of saying I would prefer an unjust peace rather than a just war. If conflict is, if you're avoiding conflict too much, to some degree, like, that's probably going to end in conflict.